In today's episode of the Neil Wilkins Podcast, I'm joined by Kevin Hanegan, the author of Turning Data into Wisdom. Kevin really is a data and AI specialist. He is currently the chair of the advisory board for the Data Literacy Project and is author of multiple books. And I'm sure we're going to go there at a number of points in this conversation. So welcome to the episode, Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Neil. Looking forward to this one for sure.
Yeah, and I am too, because this is certainly in my experience, one of those things that marketers and business owners are kind of, I think, probably en masse still putting off. I think you and I know the big value of data and the biggest value of big data, if we could call it that. But I think for a lot of people, it's that kind of mystical art or science that they kind of almost don't feel qualified for. So I think hopefully if we can sort of break down those myths and break down some of those, feelings into something that's a bit more accessible, that would be a really great and value outcome sort of from this conversation. I mean, but where to start though, Kevin? Because this is always the thing I find challenging is, it's a big old topic, this, isn't it? I mean, what actually is data literacy?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that is part of the challenge is people first hear the word data and they say, time out, not for me. I'm an English major, I'm in history, I'm not for data. I think that's what we have to educate people on is data is really everything. It's the foundation. So people sometimes think data is numbers and facts, and then they think spreadsheets, and then they think mathematics and statistics. The lowest level data could be anything that's shared. It doesn't have to be numbers. It could be qualitative. So surveys, focus groups. So ask, the audience, think, when was the last time you read reviews of a movie, or you read reviews of something you bought on Amazon or an Airbnb you wanted to go, or in the business place, when did you get customer feedback? That is all data. It's just, in and of itself, it's a small piece of a puzzle. We like to kind of aggregate it to higher level thinking. So from data, you kind of go to information, which is where you start to see patterns and put pieces together. So on the number side, it might be, okay, I don't care about this individual sale. I care about like my average sales for the month or the week. Or if it's qualitative, if one person gives bad feedback, that's a point in time, right? And it could be an outlier and it could be for very valid reasons, but let's aggregate it. Let's say, okay, what was the feedback from 100 of our customers or 100 of our prospects? And that's kind of the information. But then you move it up in your brain to what I like to call knowledge, which is how you take that information and data, apply it to the question that you're trying to solve. And this is where understanding, not math or science, but understanding the domain is relevant. So, for example, unrelated to business, if I want to analyze what coffee pot I should buy, I go on Amazon, I find all the reviews, I aggregate them. The knowledge is, okay, well, what is my question? Is I want to find a coffee maker for me that's specific. What am I looking for? Speed, size, durability, strength, like all these different things. And I need to apply the information to that knowledge. And that's the first place we have hiccups is our brains tend to apply them unitarily. Like, this was a bad review, it's not for me. That's not the case. It might be different to what we want it for. So eventually we come up with this hypothesis. Here's the best coffee for me. Here's the best decision with my sales marketing strategy. And we test it out and we apply and we learn from it. And ultimately, that's where we get to wisdom. So to me, data literacy is basically critical thinking in the 21st century. All of the stuff you're exposed to, how does it relate to your objectives and your goals? And how is it going to help you make a better decision?
Oh, I love this. And this is something that, I guess I've been trying over the years to be as eloquent as you are in terms of kind of describing that process of something which is a series of ones and zeros into something that actually can help me in my life. And that's beautifully put, just in terms of that journey of data to something that is useful for decision making. I guess in lots of ways, certainly one of the things that I do when I talk to marketers, business owners, entrepreneurs about this kind of a topic is that I try and sort of steer them, and I'd be very interested in your take on this because I might not be doing this right, but I kind of try and steer them towards think of the questions before looking for the answers. And the analogy I always use is something like, say, Google Analytics, for example, because if you log into your Google Analytics account, a lot of data in there, a lot of stuff that you can play with. But actually you can find yourself going down lots of these little rabbit holes and you never come out. It's like these little dead end alleys, and you think, what have I just learned? I don't know, but I've just used 30 minutes of my life trying to find something that I don't even know what I'm looking at. Whereas actually, if you begin something like Google Analytics with a series of questions and then almost use in a kind of forensic detective work kind of way, use the tool to try and then unpick the answer to the questions. But it's almost like you have to know the questions first. Am I doing this the right way round? Is that correct advice?
Interesting. 100% correct advice. But it's not what most humans do, which is why it might seem weird. And I'll put it this way. Would you rather go into an escape room and be given a haystack and say, find a needle, and you know nothing about the needle? Or would you rather learn about the needle first, which is your outcomes? How am I going to get out? It's the size, the width. So in life, there is exploratory analytics. Like, here's massive data, find something relevant. But to your point, you could spend 30 minutes, you could spend 30 days. You find something that is truly insightful, but it completely doesn't relate to your goals or your strategy or objectives. So it's not actionable. The only way to make sure it's actionable is almost flip the model and start with the question, start with the goal. What are we trying to solve? Because it's going to be easier for you to find the data. If you don't have access to the data, it's easier for you to understand there's some uncertainty, maybe ask for the data, maybe go in different tangents, but everything is going to be more specific. I mean, imagine being a kid in a English class where they ask you to write an essay and they say, write the essay. And that's all the instructions. You have no idea what you're doing. You're freaking out. Like, am I going the right path? What are they? Versus where they give you very clear, same thing with AI. If you ask AI a very generic question, what do you think of this play? What do you think of this data? Who knows what you're going to get back with it, because it's adding in all those specificities that we should add in up front. Absolutely. And I'm not saying you add it in front and you're done. It's an iterative process, just like it is with AI. You learn, you apply, you adjust, but you have to start with the question. You have to start with the goal. I have one funny anecdote, which I don't know if it's an urban legend or not, but it kind of goes related to this, where there was a 5-star Michelin chef was starting a restaurant, and he hired like the most impressive recruiting staff to find him the head chef. And apparently what he said was, I'm a chef, you know me, go find this person who can run the restaurant. They went, they hired someone, they found him. After 2 days, it was an absolute flop. Now, in retrospect, what happened was the chef didn't share enough details. They thought it was, okay, hire someone like him. The funny thing was he was opening basically a modified fast food joint. So the goal was speed. It wasn't 5-star recipes. So the first 2 days, they were taking 20 minutes to get fast food orders out. All hell broke loose. The moral of the story was, if you start with that question, that's not going to happen.
So starting with the question is key, isn't it, here? And I think, for a lot of people, and particularly people in this audience listening to this, we know the kind of roles that you're very likely to be in is those kind of decision makers. You're looking maybe to be spending a budget appropriately. You could be, looking at next year's strategic plan. So you're looking for the evidence to back up where you believe you're looking to go. Is there a kind of, if that is the starting point, and that is the people that we're talking to here, Kevin, is there a kind of almost a danger that you, by starting with the question, though, you miss out on some of the little nuances that might open up an opportunity to innovate? Because by asking the question, it's almost you're preempting what you want the answer to be. Is there a danger that actually works against you by doing it like this?
Yes and no. Like, in theory, just what you said, absolutely. But I would argue is, and I should phrase it, maybe you're not starting with the question, you're starting with the goal, and then you have the question. So if your organizational goal is to increase revenue through innovation, then one of your questions should very well be, what are we looking in here? Maybe a different segmentation of our customers. Maybe there's a different gap in the product. You're identifying, and it's not a single question, right? You might be asking 50 different questions. But if your goal is a consolidation play, you're probably not looking for innovation. So you could miss things, but if you identify them early in the question, ties to your goal. So I'm a big fan of using strategic analysis, using goal planning, and then listing your questions. So if I want to do a diversification play, my questions are going to be around diversification for the most part, until we get into like the operational level. If mine's around more of an expansion play or similar revenue generation, then those should be things in my question. So long story short, yes, but I think you might miss things that maybe you're not focused on. So there is a chance that maybe there's something out there that you didn't stress as a goal, and that could be the mismatch. And that's why goal setting is so important, because if you don't set it there, everything trickles down for sure. But if it is a goal, I don't think you miss it, because it's going to be part of your questions.
I love this. And honestly, I wish I'd had this conversation like a few decades back, because you've just now extended the whole kind of journey of data for me. You've added two kind of upstream elements here, which I've not really considered. I was, I kind of get the question bit, but actually having the goals set prior to that, or at least kind of formed or formulated, and then use the process of data to inform how accurate they might be, or to give you the evidence to back up that they are the correct things. Oh, this is great stuff. So at the moment then, in my head, and I'll plot this out in my head for everybody listening, if you've got a notepad and pen, or you've got your fingers over your keyboards, this is the kind of order I think, and Kevin can now critique whether this works. So we've got goal to question to data to analysis, to interpretation, to evaluation, to wisdom.
100% agree. And just a couple things about what you said. The interpretation, the valuation, they're all critical phases. But the interpretation, the valuation is the one I find most of us miss, partly because of the way the brain works. That's where we're open to bias. That's where we're open to incorrect assumptions. That's where we're open to just saying, here was the analysis, here's the insight, here's my answer. Let's skip that whole interpretation of value. We don't do it on purpose. And then everything you said in the beginning is perfect. Goal to data. I guess even if you want to go one step further, before you define the goal, there's going to be data and information you're doing when you're doing like a strategic analysis, whether it be like a SWOT or similar, that's going to give you the answers for what your goals are. I would say I like to do the strategic analysis. Then I like to say, from there, here are my goals for the next 2 to 3 years, based off of what I'm seeing through my strength, weakness, and all of that's data, right? It might be qualitative, but it's data. So I say strategy, analysis, goal, data, then moving forward.
And now I'm seeing something extra here as well, which is really good. This is why I love this conversation. Is because then I'm starting to think, oh, okay, so if you're putting some pre-work in there or some pre-data in there to kind of even start to, as you say, shape up those goals or potential goals, which you're going to critique later, it feels then that once you come to the end of the journey, you're then back where you started. So this is now circular rather than a linear process. We're circular, aren't we? Because by the time you get to the end, you've got your wisdom. You then realize, okay, now I've got to fine tune it. So I've got to go right the way back around again. And so we're in this kind of this loop that never ends, aren't we? Once you're using data for decision making, you don't stop. You just keep on going around this loop.
In an ideal world, exactly. Wisdom is meant to be, in fact, my one sentence definition is evaluated understanding. You want to go back and apply that. I say in theory, because a lot of times people don't do that, is they'll stop at the wisdom. They won't iterate. And that's, to me, the holy grail. Is you're never going to get it perfect the first time, right? It's always going to get more data. You're always going to have the internal, external trends changing where you have to tweak it. And so I'd say to some level, the fastest you can do that cycle, the better you're going to be competitively. But at a minimum, do it iteratively, do it as a cycle. Absolutely. If you stop at wisdom and then move on to something else and then try to start all over from square one, you're going to get beat out by all your competitors because they're doing it cyclical.
Yeah, because I'm thinking now about a lot of the teaching of marketers that I do, and there's something which I always suggest at the end of campaigns or the end of project reports or the end of any kind of marketing style initiative, is I'll always say, okay, as part of your conclusion, your roundup, leave a legacy for that project. And it tends to be a process improvement, or it tends to be something that might be a little bit of a leave behind. So if they then get promoted or leave the business, they've left this almost like blueprint or template for somebody else to pick it up. Now, from this conversation, I'm starting to think I've missed a moment here, because what we could also add into that mix at that kind of round off of a project is, what other data or evidence would be useful to be capturing to begin version 2 or to begin the next time we do this campaign or project. So actually putting data stroke evaluation stroke wisdom into that kind of that roundup stage of a project, because that to me then gets really interesting, because then it's not just about what I'm going to do, but it's actually underpinning the new evidence that I'm going to have to capture to encourage me and others to go around this loop again. Because otherwise, and I see it as well with campaigns, particularly, with clients and other marketers that I kind of coach or mentor. I often see it's like, well, we finished that, so now we're on to the next project. And they feel because they've rounded it off, that was enough and it's done. Whereas actually there almost needs to be these threads between previous projects and the new upcoming ones that are linked by data. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but to me, that makes logical sense, that data is that kind of common bond between previous projects and future ones. Would you see it that way?
Absolutely. I mean, at high level, we always say we learn from history, right? That's what you're saying in an organizational setting. And there is a theory out there, which I'm a huge fan of, called double loop learning, which basically says exactly what you said. At the end of a project or at the end of learning something, don't just question the outcome, question the process. And so to your point, don't just question, okay, this is where we got with our analysis. Question, okay, what else could we have done to get better data? What different data could we have? What different questions? And when we train ourselves to not just focus on the outcome, but also focus on the process, it's better, because you could have a good campaign by chance and the process was horrible. And if you don't have the team critically challenge the process, they're not going to evolve and learn from it. And they're not going to think differently. So conversely, you could have a really good process, but something changed midstream and your outcome is not ideal. Knowing whether the outcome was not ideal because something changed or you have a flaw in your process, I mean, that's gold, right? Wouldn't you want to know, okay, well, we missed the mark here. We didn't hit our target. We didn't hit it because we had these two assumptions, which we proved to be incorrect. Let's modify the process. But again, the human brain doesn't tend to think that way. We tend to think outcome, light bulb's green, great, move on, next one.
Yeah, I'm interested in this kind of, how the brain is making decisions, because a lot of this is, I know we're going to talk, in a moment about sort of AI and, sort of some of these new options and tools that have suddenly appeared, in our armory that we can start to use. For me, one of the really interesting things, though, is just this idea of, understanding how we're using the data to make decisions, because it feels, and you've mentioned this already a couple of times, it feels as though we need to understand how, not just the what to do, but also the how to do it, because our brains don't seem to be almost our sort of friend when we're actually going through this process. It feels like there's something that's kind of potentially working against us here. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Because I'd love to know what that is.
It's fascinating for anyone out there that has kids. I guess I'll start at the very low level. You probably get annoyed, but how many times do they say why? Right? It's like the thing. It's like, okay, well, we're there yet. Why this? Why that? If you take a step back, the reason they're saying why is their brain is empty. They're new kids, right? They don't have a long-term memory. They don't have previous experiences. So they're learning by applying and asking why. As we get older, our brains are full. Well, maybe not full technically, but they have a lot of our old memories and experiences. So unconsciously, sometimes we're thinking we might already know the answer because we heard it in 1982 and this is the answer. So we stop asking why. But if we take a step back, we're exposed to millions of things every day. If you look at all the different senses, and we have to make hundreds of thousands of decisions every day. Most of them we don't think about. Like maybe you think about, what do I wear? What do I eat? But like if you're walking down the street and you see like this big bird flying at you, you don't stop and say, is it going to hit me? What's going to happen if it hits me? You duck or you move, right? It's unconscious. You just do it. All of those decisions that are done unconsciously, sometimes we call them gut decisions in business or intuition. It's actually data. What it's doing is it's going into your long-term memory and say, okay, I'm 47 years old. I've had 10 trillion experiences similar to this. In these situations, this is what I did. This was the outcome. This is what I want to do. And you make that decision and you don't realize it. Now, step forward to today. What's different is what was relevant in 1982, what was relevant 2 weeks ago might not be relevant anymore in the business world. Everything hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were dinosaurs, we had storms, We needed to get protection from shelter, and we needed food. Didn't even change. Even when my parents went to school, they went to school for the same thing. They worked their entire life as teachers. They retired. They didn't need to upskill. Things didn't change. They didn't go from cable to streaming. They didn't go from print to digital. Everything's different. So unconsciously, we're making a decision. It's based off a previous experience, but that experience might be outdated or it might be wrong. And I tell this story kind of jokingly, but also embarrassed. When I grew up, the neighbor used to always shoot BB guns at our house. My parents couldn't stand them and had really red head. So unconsciously, everything going in my senses is, okay, redhead bad. And then there was a movie out, it was called The Problem Child, where the kid was red hair. Just validated my stigma and my stereotype. And so I don't think I obviously consciously was prejudiced against redheads, but it was always, that's how the brain works. It was always in my head until I have 4 kids. My third one literally came out of the womb with flaming red hair. So much so that we're Irish. We actually had to change his name because we're like, that's not an Irish redhead name. We had to change it on the fly. And that was the reason I share that, is that was the trigger for my brain to say, wait a second. Redheads aren't problem kids, because my kid's just born. He's not a problem kid. He's like the sweetest kid in the world. So the way we make decisions is based off of our past experiences. It's based off what's happened before. No one in the world can ever say, I've handled every situation. I've encountered every culture. I've encountered every problem. So our view of it is a very small slice. We get different perspectives. We get different slices. We're open to it. So long way of saying decision-making is actually a beautiful science in the brain. But if you have stuff that's stored in your brain that happened years ago that's not relevant, or it's based off an assumption, based off your experience, because we're all still emotional beings, you're not going to make the best decision. That's why we're so prone to bias. That's why we're so prone to, like what I said, stereotyping, profiling, all of those things. It's unfortunate, but it's because we're adults. We have all of these past experiences where you won't innately see a kid, be discriminatory because they're just asking why. They don't have that experience.
So bias is something that is kind of coming through whichever way you look at this. You can look at the media, you can look at maybe in whatever sector you're operating in. You can see it is the big debate right now, isn't it? Obviously, with the infiltration of AI into pretty much every part of our business or businesses in terms of tools and additional technology stacks, etc. In terms of bias, then, I mean, if it's always been there, we as, I guess, human beings are able to rationalize it, understand it. You obviously recognized yours. We all have them. It's not a thing to be embarrassed about. It's just what makes us human. How do you kind of sort of feel that, the whole AI emergence and evolution is going to need to, and it probably is the word need, isn't it, to, with our lovely loop of data decision making that we've kind of encountered here, or sort of constructed, and how is AI going to really cope with that in terms of managing bias, which is inevitably going to be part of it at some point or another?
Absolutely. The first thing I'll say too is that, talking to hundreds of thousands of people, there still is a percentage of the population that doesn't believe bias is real. They think it's magic or voodoo. And I think that's the first hurdle is like you rightfully said, like we all have it. It's not intentional, right? We're not doing it, but the best way to overcome it is starting with awareness. So I think the first challenge we have is there's a decent segment of the world that doesn't understand how bias works. Therefore, they don't think they have it. They think every decision they make is rational. They don't think it's based off of discriminatory practices or whatever. Now, translating to AI is really good at what our brain isn't good at, and our brain is really good at what AI isn't good at. So if we have jobs where we're doing number crunching, we're trying to find clusters of typical customers to market against. AI can do that 10 times better than we can. But you have to remember what AI is we're giving it data, lots of data, to build out. Basically, this is not the best analogy, but I mentioned kids start out with a blank slate in their brain. AI starts out with a blank slate. We're feeding it all of those memories in the matter of like nanoseconds. So it could be biased if everything we're feeding it is biased. And we call that training bias because we're training the AI model. So if I'm only feeding it stuff from a certain segmentation of my customers, it's going to be biased against the ones that weren't in there. If I'm only feeding it against certain cultures or demographic areas, it's going to be biased against the ones that are outside of that. So humans still need to play a part, because we need to understand that and say, okay, we're not just going to give it biased data, we're going to give it holistic data. And famous stories of like self-driving cars that went wrong because the data went in, didn't give it everything. So it saw certain types of humans as animals, or other types of situations where it would profile against certain cultures when they were using it to see if someone was going to commit a crime. It's the same thing as a kid's brain. We're feeding it all that info. It's just we're not doing it over 18 years. We're doing it over, a couple of weeks. So bias is even more important, because there are some people that think AI it's a computer. It's correct. Computers are always correct. Computers don't lie. So if the AI says, let's reject this credit card, or let's, not market to this segment, people are like, okay, well, AI did it. It's a computer. Computers never lie. It must be right. It's not right if the training data that it was given wasn't right, or wasn't ethical, I should say, because that's the other component. Is it might be factually correct data, but it might not be ethical data if you're missing certain populations. So I think it's important, all of us working with AI, to understand the fact that it can be just as biased as us, and it can even be worse, because people tend to think computers don't lie, so they're not biased. Even now with generative AI, where it's not doing number crunching, but it's doing creation of data. It's trained on large data sets. If it has no knowledge of something that's over here, and you ask a question of something that's over here, it's going to give you a blatantly wrong answer, but it sounds realistic. So you're going to say, wow, that makes sense. It sounds plausible. That's my answer. No. So all of us, we might not all be using AI to crunch numbers, but we're all using like ChatGPT to, ask questions and whatever. It can be very wrong if you don't question it and ask it where it got its data, if there's different perspectives. So I think it's just the human brain on steroids, which means AI is still going to permeate everywhere.
Yeah, this is fascinating for me, because I think a lot of people, and again, we're seeing lots of reports and research over this, a feeling that AI is coming for my job. I think, a lot of people are, fearful, particularly in production, distribution, and, these kinds of roles. It's interesting the way you describe it, though, because to me, should you be correct in the long term, and I'm sure, there's a lot of evidence to say that actually you are correct, is that actually in our loop that we were talking about before, it feels then that there are certain points in that loop of activity, from setting the goals all the way through to making the decisions, leaving the legacy, etc. There are certain parts there of that process where AI can really, really assist. But then there's also certain parts of that process where you would not want to go there with AI. You want a human to take the reins of that particular point in the process. So it kind of feels like we could be then thinking of AI from a data perspective, turning it into wisdom as being almost our trusted internal trusted ally who sat next to us, kind of working through this process, and we do it with them. So they can do, maybe, as you described it, some of the number crunching up front, and okay, present me some options. And then we as a human being don't take them as a fait accompli. We're actually going to look at these options, and then we'll critique them from our experience and our knowledge. And then we put those back into the AI and say, right, now can you do the next step? And then we'll take it up from there, and then it's back to AI. Do you feel this is kind of like almost an interchange of roles, rather than just saying AI knows all the answers, let's just let it be a robot and give us this perfect, panacea of an outcome? It doesn't sound like that's ever going to happen. So there's a part for both of us there, really, isn't there?
There has to be, exactly. I think, like you said, a lot of people are worried about losing jobs to automation. There will be tasks that do not require a lot of critical thinking or a lot of emotions, or understanding systems, where yes, the AI or robotic process automation will automate it, but you always need that human in that loop, and that human needs to have certain skill sets, which is why we talk about upskilling. You're not learning necessarily like machine learning. You're learning critical thinking. You're learning systems thinking. You're learning, how to be creative, how to be curious, things that, again, we have as kids and we kind of lose throughout our life because we don't apply them that much. So it definitely, to me, seems like it's got to be a marriage, as opposed to, a divorce where we lose our job, we move off. And a famous example, Garry Kasparov, the Grand Chess Master, There's a bigger story on it. People can Google it, but at the end of it, he lost to IBM Watson and the AI computer. And it got him thinking, what can we do here? So he did a series of tests, and test that's been repeated over and over again is he took a grandmaster champion, partnered them with AI, took a person that knows chess but is not a grandmaster champion, just a typical chess player, partnered them with AI, and they would draw. And so they're like, wow, what is the takeaway? The takeaway is you let AI do the number crunching, but the human provides the strategy and provides the human elements, and it can make you as good as a grandmaster champ with AI. That is really powerful for businesses, is you don't necessarily maybe need a grandmaster champ. At the same time, that's really scary for humans. Like, well, I went to school for 50 years. What do you say? It's all about changing and evolving. Is you still, those people that are not great at chess, they still needed to be critical thinkers. They still needed to be creative with asking the AI what different techniques they should use. And they just saved their brain, because it is an organ. It gets tired. They didn't tire themselves on the number crunching, so they could stay kind of smart. To me, it's one of the fascinating research studies that encapsulates everything you're talking about, is they're meant to augment each other and work collaboratively, not take over the other one.
And there's a lot of research. I mean, anyone who wants to go even deeper than our conversation here today, if you watched or listened to the McKinsey podcast on AI, there's a lot of, I mean, your analogies actually, Kevin, your storytelling is just brilliant, because it just brings it to life. And it's just so easy to consume, and I'm getting it and understanding it, which is really helpful. And that McKinsey podcast is a similar kind of style, where it's making this stuff easy to consume. And I guess this is the whole point of, data with or without AI, is it is about the reporting and the sharing and the collaboration of that kind of the outputs and the decision making that come from it. So it is, I mean, is your view that kind of it's an enabler, ultimately, data and the use of it in kind of wise decision making, is that it enables us to have like decent conversations where we can actually muse over, what is this actually telling us? Look, there's the facts, there's the data, there's the evidence. Let's talk about this and go deeper. And what else would we want to know? It's kind of it's almost inspiring, isn't it? And motivating as a communication tool. And I think if people reframe it in that way, rather than, as you said at the outset, it's just a bunch of numbers and it's complicated and it's really hard, which is very off-putting, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
This would be a nicer way of kind of consuming data, wouldn't it, really?
It would. I completely agree with you. And so much so that I wonder if maybe the name data literacy does more harm than good. Maybe it should be something like information literacy, which is a thing as well, usually with librarians, or critical thinking in the digital world. Like, that's really what we're talking about here, is the critical thinking in the digital world and learning those types of skills, being curious, understanding systems. That's going to make it go so far. But I like how you described it. It's an enabler for us, like where it's not doing our job. We have to provide the question. We have to provide the goals. We have to provide the strategy. We can ask it to assess our strategic, predicaments and what we're working towards. But at the end of the day, we should be the ones driving the path, and we should use data to support it, not to blindly support it. Like we talked about bias before. Confirmation bias is one of the biggest ones we have as humans, where we have an opinion, we see a piece of data, and we say, there's my answer. I was right. Case closed, move on. That's going to be the biggest challenge moving forward, is there's so much data. We're educating people on bias. We're educating people on how to use data and AI. I don't want people to see one response out of context and say, I validated my answer. I'm right, move on. It requires more work. It requires us, as I mentioned, creative thinking, critical thinking, but it requires us to almost be a little more reflective about ourselves and say, I might not be right. I might be wrong. In my case with my son, I had the emotional jolt that my son came out red-haired. That was enough to trigger my brain and say, well, time out. Something's not adding up. Most times you don't have that big jolt. It's very subtle and it gets missed. So it's about us to reflect and say, I need to challenge it, even if it tells me what I think it tells me is leaning to my opinion. Let's try to disprove it. Let's try to disprove it enough until we say, okay, we've done our job. That's going to be the biggest trick moving forward and the biggest challenge.
I mean, moving forward, where do you see this? If you had, Kevin's crystal ball, and you could look into this thing and you could see us, I don't know, maybe 5, even 10 years ahead. I know 10 years in the current climate is a long, long way, but let's just say, in the medium term kind of future, where do you think as businesses, as corporations, as startups, even, because a lot of startups are very data driven right now. I mean, where do you think we'll be? What will we be using? What kind of tools will our kind of approach to data be different? Do you feel we'll be in a very different place then?
There's probably going to be more tools that will take parts of the cycle and make it a single stack. Like right now, you have the data integration, the data collection, the data analytics, even sometimes the storytelling and the communicating with data. And sometimes if you have a little bit of an automation, like you have a decision intelligence tool to, if you ever go to the supermarket and you check out, they put like a coupon on the back of your receipt. Those are all digital automations using data based off what you bought. I think more and more you're going to see software come out that tries to do end-to-end all of those types of things, which may work, may not work. But I think the biggest change we're going to see is innovation is going to be exponential. The growth we went through in the past decade or two is going to be nothing compared to this, because we have the augmentation of AI to help us. We'll be able to solve cancer faster. We'll be able to go farther in space. We'll be able to address climate challenge quicker, as long as we have the human element that is understanding what's being said and not, biased against it. There's that always, I say that specifically with environmental and climate data, is we can get, closer to the right answers, but you still need the humans to believe the data, which is sometimes a challenge because it's so easy to get a different data point that says something else, which is inaccurate or misleading.
So would you say then we always need to be on the lookout for trends rather than single data points, because obviously they can, be something indicating something that's on the decline or the increase, and looking at one point doesn't actually tell you that. So is it always trends is the answer?
I think so. Again, not to get political, but you look at like climate data, environmental data. I don't really care about what the temperature was today. I care about what the temperature's trending. I don't necessarily care about what it is today in my hometown. I care about globally, is it increasing or decreasing? So trends are important. Not to say you want to ignore outliers, because outliers, to me, I treat them as like an early warning system. Is something going off? Let's look into it deeper. But it's not the answer. It's the, hey, let's look into this. And it could just be an anomaly. It could just be, those happen in life. It's nature. But it could be the start of something. So yes, look at the trends, but also look at the outliers, but look at them in a different way to see, is this the start of a change? Is it the start of a trend? Or is it just, one-off event that you can just basically say, okay, don't worry about it. And to that point, talking about the future, and I don't want to get on a preaching podium, but I think schools are going to start going back to teaching critical thinking, teaching systems thinking, teaching creativity. I always joke that, we learn those as kids. We ask why, and then we go to school. I took 12 years of reading, 12 years of writing. The biggest form of communication is listening. I never took a course in listening. I probably should have. Never took a course in systems thinking, yet the world is a system. Never took a course in critical thinking, yet I think it's absolutely imperative that we do this. And then we go to our schools, we go to our jobs, and we challenge the teacher politely. Usually what happens is the teacher says, don't talk back to me. I'm the teacher. I'm right. So we kind of suppress these skills that are really important with AI. So I think the big thing is we kind of have this, not evolution, like back to the future of soft skills is going to be more important than ever.
Wow. There it is. You said it. I think I couldn't agree more. I absolutely couldn't agree more. And I think, this is one topic that, none of us can get away from: personal life, professional life. It is just there. And I think, the more we can embrace it, the more we can frame it in a way that it's going to help us. If we can base everything on evidence rather than just hearsay or gossip or celebrity or influencer and all these kind of, modern media biases, then we're actually going to be able to make sound decisions going forward. And I think ultimately for all of us, this is what we need, is what we desire. And I think, humanity alongside AI has an opportunity to kind of collaborate in a really fundamentally authentic and positive way. Feels good. I feel positive after this conversation. I feel like there's opportunity. It's less than kind of being a scary thing and the data is going to kind of transform us in ways we don't understand and everything's going to take over. It feels like actually there's a lot more control and opportunity for seeing positive outcomes. Do you feel that it's positive?
I feel that there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of potential. I feel positive because I think we know a path forward that's going to work. I feel hopeful and even optimistic, but there is work to be ahead, because you said it eloquently just there about, there's a way where we can understand the data and make decisions. There's the other component of it, which is why I think the soft skills is so important, that even if we got over our bias and we made the right decisions, we still need to communicate them to people. And this is where, especially in marketing, like framing is everything. And I don't think we as humans all have the right EQ and the right framing. You might have the best answer if you can't get that over. And I even, just a quick analogy, this weekend I was coaching one of my son's football teams, and the other coach kept saying things to the ref, like negative, like, oh, they were out of bounds. Oh, you need to stop the clock. I was like, he's obviously getting nowhere. In fact, he's probably doing a disservice, because they're probably going to, make more calls against them. All I do is I reframe it like it's my fault. So I would go to the ref and say, sir, the clock's still running, right? When I thought the clock shouldn't be running. It sounds subtle, but instantly the ref's like, oh, no, it's not. They went out of bounds. Thank you for asking. Whereas if I came in and said, why is the clock running? It shouldn't be running. It's negative. So that it's very subtle, but that reframing is so important, and we don't do it. We don't teach it. People don't know how to do that. They just get emotional and they say, why are you messing up? You're going to get nowhere. I mean, I'm always a big fan of, you're going to get more bees with honey. With this in business, you're going to get more change when you actually understand the other person and you reframe it so that you're not coming off as whatever that was, either hostile or aggressive or like they're wrong, you're right. So yes, there's optimism, but there's a lot of work to do.
And again, I think it's the collaboration of this work, I think, and the sharing of, wisdoms like you have here, that I think is going to help us all on this journey. So I'd like to signpost people in your direction, Kevin. I mean, turningdataintowisdom.com, is that the best place for people to pick up further assets and tools and tips?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's relatively new. I started it a couple months ago, but it's got, I do a weekly blog, or not even a blog, it's an article that has all these different topics, whether it be AI, data literacy, decision-making. We have some longer form white papers. There's one out there on a framework you can use to use AI to augment your thinking, as opposed to just create things, how it can help you question techniques. And then we have links to videos and trainings and tutorials and books as well. So yeah, I'd love people to check it out.
Brilliant. And I've got the first in a number of AI and metaverse marketing courses that I'm running next week. And I'm going to be pointing people to this very resource. Nice. Because after this conversation, people need to know this stuff. So yeah, we're going to share far and wide, Kevin. Don't worry about that. It's going to happen.
Awesome.
Certainly on this side. So thank you so much for your time and the sage advice today. It's just been a really interesting way of reframing, I think, for a lot of people, this what previously, prior to this episode, I think would have been quite a complicated topic. And I think you've really, really clarified and, just made it so obvious to us all that we need to take this thing seriously and frame it properly in our businesses. So thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.